The 12th of March 1945. Camp Rupert, Idaho. The air held the sharp scent of pine resin and lye soap from the laundry building. Akiko kept her arm steady around Miki, the younger girl shivering despite the borrowed wool blanket. Miki had arrived only yesterday, her eyes wide with the same terror Akiko herself had carried for months. An American guard, rifle slung casually, approached them during the evening count. Miki flinched violently, hiding her face against Akiko's shoulder. Akiko tensed, an old reflex, but did not move. She watched the guard's boots stop on the packed dirt. He just nodded, marked his clipboard, and moved on. The camp rules, posted by the mess hall, stated, "All prisoners will be treated in accordance with Geneva Convention protocols." Akiko had once thought those words a lie. Now, she felt Miki trembling. "Daijobu?" Akiko whispered, her voice low. "It is okay. They are different here." She remembered the incident that had taught her that. The shattering sound of porcelain on frozen ground, the shouting, and the impossible words that followed. If this story of unexpected humanity resonates with you, consider subscribing and letting us know what country you are watching from. 6 weeks earlier, Camp Rupert internment zone. The truck stopped, its engine cutting out with a hydraulic sigh that seemed louder than the hours of rumbling that had preceded it. For Akiko, the silence that followed was worse. It was a cold, thin silence, sharp with the smell of pine and diesel. This was Idaho. January 1945. The name meant nothing to her. Just a sound on a map the American driver had pointed to. Out. Move. The canvas flap was thrown back, flooding the truck bed with a painfully bright, snow-reflected light. Akiko flinched, shielding her eyes. Her limbs were numb, locked from the cold and the crouching. She and the other women nurses, civilian aides, a few wives of administrators captured on Guam, were herded out like livestock, stumbling onto ground, packed hard as iron. Akiko kept her head down. This was the protocol she had drilled into herself. Do not make eye contact. Do not show fear. Do not give them a reason. The propaganda films had been clear. The American Kichiku, barbarians, were animals who preyed on weakness. She expected the shouting to escalate, the inevitable shove, the strike. Instead, there was only the cold and a strange, bureaucratic order. They were marched into a long, wooden barracks that smelled of raw lumber and carbolic soap. It was warm, and the sudden change made her dizzy. A female U.S. Army corporal with tired eyes and hair the color of straw sat behind a folding table. One by one, the women gave their names. When it was Akiko's turn, she spoke her name and rank, nurse, Imperial Army, her voice a dry croak. The corporal checked a list. Akiko Tanaka. Okay. The American woman did not look up. She seemed bored, not monstrous. This was, perhaps, the most terrifying thing of all. The banal indifference felt like a trick. Wait here, the corporal said, pointing to a bench. Akiko sat, her spine rigid. She watched the processing. There was no violence. There was no interrogation. Just paperwork. Outside the window, beyond the wire, she could see the lights of a small town in the valley below. She had heard the guards in the truck talking about it. They had complained about the locals. A snatch of their conversation came back to her. The Rupert Pioneer ran another editorial. Says we're coddling them. Says we ought to put 'em to work in the fields till their backs break, not feed 'em 3 meals a day. One of the guards had laughed. Farmer Pete is just mad he can't get cheap labor. He doesn't care about the war. He cares about his sugar beets. Coddling? The word was alien. Akiko understood sugar beets. She did not understand coddling. She only understood the expectation of pain. After an hour, her name was called again. A different soldier, an older private, motioned her forward. He pushed a folded gray blanket across the table, followed by a small bar of soap, and then he placed a small, simple object in her hands. It was a porcelain bowl. Akiko stared at it. It was cheap, utilitarian, the color of weak tea, with a small chip on the rim. It was something from a kitchen, not a prison. It was a human object. She had expected a tin cup, a wooden trough, or nothing. This made no sense. This small, chipped bowl felt heavier than a stone. It was a contradiction she could not resolve. The soldier pointed to a door. Barracks 7. Dinner is at 1800. Don't be late. She clutched the blanket and the porcelain bowl to her chest. The smooth, cold ceramic was the only thing she could feel. She walked out of the processing building and into the frozen twilight of Camp Rupert. The air was still. The promised violence had not come. She was clean, she was warm, and she was holding a bowl. Akiko trembled. The propaganda had lied, or this was the most elaborate, cruel torture she could ever have imagined. The ritual began before dawn, at 5:30. A single harsh bulb cut through the darkness of Barracks 7. The sound was not a siren, but the sharp rap of a guard's nightstick against the wooden door. Reveille! On your feet! Line up! Akiko learned the rhythm of this place through fear. The first week bled into the second, and the terrifying, bureaucratic indifference she had first observed began to show its cracks. The camp was run by two distinct types of men, the administrators, like the board corporal, and the guards. The guards were different. They were young, restless, and seemed to resent the prisoners for simply existing. The most dangerous ritual of the day was the morning sick call. It was a mandatory assembly, regardless of health, that combined a head count, a rudimentary medical check, and the distribution of breakfast. Akiko clutched her porcelain bowl. In the past 6 weeks, this small, chipped object had become her anchor. It was the one thing that was hers, a fragile link to a civilized self. She held it as she stood in the line that snaked out of the barracks and toward the infirmary, 100 women shivering in the pre-dawn gloom. The air was so cold it burned the lungs. Every breath was a cloud of white vapor. The ground was frozen solid, and the crunch of boots on the icy dirt was the only sound, punctuated by the hacking coughs of the women. Akiko kept her eyes down, her focus narrowed to the back of the woman in front of her. Become small. Become invisible. The line was overseen by a guard the women had silently named Aka Oni, the Red Demon. He was a young private, barely 20, with a face flushed pink by the cold and a perpetual, simmering anger. He walked the line with a swagger, his hand resting on the holstered pistol at his hip, though he also carried a rifle. He seemed to relish the small tremors of fear he caused. Straight line, damn it, he barked, shoving a woman who was leaning from exhaustion. No talking. Eyes front. Akiko's stomach tightened. The smell of the breakfast, thin, watery oatmeal steaming in a large metal cauldron near the infirmary door, usually made her stomach ache with hunger. Today, it just made her nauseous. She watched as the women ahead of her received their ladle of oatmeal into their bowls or cups, were glanced at by a medical orderly, and were then dismissed. It was simple. Just get through it. Then, she was at the front. The steam from the cauldron billowed into her face, momentarily warm. She held out her porcelain bowl, her hands shaking so much from the cold that the chip on the rim seemed to vibrate. The orderly, an older man who never spoke, slopped a ladle of gray mush into it. Akiko bowed her head slightly. "Arigato," she whispered, a reflex she could not stop. "What'd you say?" Akiko froze. The Red Demon, Guard 1, was standing right in front of her. She had not even seen him approach. She looked up, startled, and met his eyes by mistake. They were pale blue and filled with a cold, bored malice. I said, "What did you say?" He repeated, louder, leaning in. Akiko shook her head, her throat closing. "Nani mo?" "Nothing," she managed, using one of the few English words she knew. "Nothing. Nani. Nothing. Nani. Nothing. You speak English?" He sneered. "Or are you just another smart-mouthed?" He stopped, searching for the word. He seemed frustrated by his own inability to intimidate her further. He wanted a reaction. "Move along, prisoner," he suddenly shouted, his voice cracking in the cold air. The sudden volume, the explosion of senseless anger inches from her face, sent a jolt of pure, animal terror through her. It was the propaganda made real. This was the moment. The barbarian would finally reveal himself. Her hands, already numb, spasmed. It seemed to fall in slow motion. Akiko's entire world narrowed to that small, white object turning in the air. It struck the frozen earth with a sharp, sickening crack. The sound was absolute. The bowl shattered into a dozen pieces, the gray oatmeal splattering across the ice. Silence descended on the line. Every woman stopped breathing. The red demon stared at the mess, then at Akiko. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, look at that," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Clumsy. Now you got nothing." Akiko could not move. She stared at the fragments of her last connection to sanity, scattered on the dirt of an Idaho prison camp. She was no longer a nurse. She was not even a person. She was just a prisoner who had broken a bowl. She braced herself for the blow that had to come next. Akiko squeezed her eyes shut. She bowed her head, waiting. This was the moment. The Kichiku would finally drop the pretense of civilization. The facade of paperwork and boring corporals was over. The real America was this angry boy with the flushed face and the gun. She tensed her shoulders, a futile defense, expecting the impact of a rifle butt or a heavy boot. The silence stretched. It became heavier, more fraught than the shouting had been. "What in the hell do you think you're doing, Private?" The voice was new. It was not loud, but it cut through the frozen air with an authority that was absolute. It was calm, deep, and laced with a cold anger that was entirely different from the guard's hot-tempered rage. Akiko dared to open her eyes, just a slit. A new man stood there. He was tall, older than the guard, perhaps in his late 30s. He wore the insignia of a captain, with the medical corps caduceus pinned to his collar. He was not looking at Akiko. His entire attention was fixed on the young private. The guard, who had been looming over Akiko, snapped to a clumsy semblance of attention. His face had gone from pink to a pale white. "Sir, this prisoner," she dropped her rations, disobeyed an order. "She disobeyed what order, Private?" the captain asked, his voice quiet. He walked past the guard, deliberately placing himself between the young soldier and Akiko. He looked down at the mess on the ground, the gray oatmeal congealing on the ice, the scattered white fragments of the porcelain bowl. "The order to move along, sir." And shouting in her face was the appropriate response to that? The captain did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Was that part of your training? To terrorize unarmed women? "Sir." "No, but they are prisoners of war," the captain interrupted, his voice sharp for the first time. "They are under my medical jurisdiction, and they are protected by the Articles of the Geneva Convention. Articles which you, apparently, have failed to read." He bent down, not all the way, and picked up the largest piece of the shattered porcelain bowl. He held the white shard in his gloved hand. He turned back to the private. "You are relieved of duty on this line. Report to Sergeant Coombs. Tell him I said you are on latrine duty for the next 2 weeks. Go. Now." The private's face was a mask of humiliation and fury. He shot a look of pure hatred, not at the captain, but at Akiko. Then, he slung his rifle, turned sharply, and stalked away. The line was utterly silent. The other women stared, their faces blank with disbelief. The captain stood there for a long moment, still holding the piece of broken ceramic. He looked at the other guards. "Get this line moving. Get these women fed. They will not be punished for this." He then did the impossible. He turned to Akiko. She flinched, expecting a different kind of reprimand. He was still the enemy. This was just a power play. One officer correcting another. He was not looking at her with anger. He was looking at her with something she could not name. It looked like embarrassment. He looked down at the broken piece of the bowl in his hand, then back at her. He took a breath. "I apologize," he said. Akiko's mind went blank. She did not understand. The word was English, but the meaning was inconceivable. He must have seen the total incomprehension on her face. He spoke again, slower, simpler, as if to a child. "I apologize for his behavior. That was not correct. That was wrong." He dropped the broken shard into a nearby trash can. He motioned to the orderly, who had been frozen in place. "Get her another bowl. A metal one. And a full ration." The orderly scrambled to comply, handing Akiko a standard-issue tin bowl, which he filled. Akiko took it. Her hands were steady now, not because the fear was gone, but because a new, profound, and disorienting shock had replaced it. She looked at the captain. He just nodded, a curt, professional gesture, and turned to walk toward the infirmary. Akiko stood alone in the line, holding a warm tin bowl, her entire world tilting on its axis. He had apologized. A man had punished another man for being cruel to her, and then he had apologized. This was not a trap. This was worse. It was a truth she had no place to put. The apology was a disease. It spread through barracks 7 faster than the influenza that had swept through the camp the month before. That night, Akiko sat on her cot, the new tin bowl cold in her lap. It was functional. It held food, but it had no history. It was not hers. The memory of her porcelain bowl shattering on the ice was now intrinsically linked to the captain's impossible words. "A trap," insisted Etsuko, an older woman who had been a head nurse in Manila. "It is a known psychological tactic. They show you one good man to make you lower your guard. They want information. They want you to break." "But the Aka Oni," whispered Miki, a young aide. "He was punished. We all saw it. He is gone. Today." The guards were quiet. They replaced him with another. Etsuko countered, her voice sharp. "The trap is not the private. The trap is the captain, the one who speaks softly. He is the more dangerous of the two. Stay away from him." Akiko said nothing. She had been trained to observe. As a nurse, she diagnosed patients not just by what they said, but by their breathing, the color of their skin, the tension in their shoulders. She had observed Private 1. His anger was simple, like a child's. But she had also observed Captain Miller. His anger at the private had been cold and righteous. His embarrassment, that was the part that made no sense. It was a complex, human emotion. She had to know. For the next week, Akiko watched. She performed her camp duties, laundry, cleaning, sweeping with a new, hidden purpose. She learned to track the captain's movements. She learned, through overheard conversations and subtle observation, what Etsuko had partially understood. The camp had 2 masters. There were the guards, the enlisted men who manned the towers and fences, men who carried rifles and resentment. And there were the administrators and medical staff. Captain Miller was the chief medical officer. His authority over the camp's health was absolute, dictated by the Geneva Convention protocols that were posted, as if in defiance, in the mess hall and the infirmary. The guards answered to a different command, but Miller, it seemed, could override them when a prisoner's welfare was at stake. He had not intervened to be kind. He had intervened because the private had violated a rule. This understanding made Akiko feel colder. It was not humanity. Then, it was bureaucracy. But the question remained, why had he apologized? The rules did not require an apology. She found herself near the infirmary during her afternoon sweeping detail. It was the one building she had avoided. The one place that reminded her too acutely of her lost life. It smelled like her hospital in Tokyo. The sharp, clean sting of carbolic acid, the metallic tang of sterilization, the faint, sweet odor of iodine. The door was propped open for ventilation. She kept her broom moving, back and forth, her eyes scanning the interior from the shadows of the porch. She saw him. He was not wearing his heavy outer coat, just his officer's shirt. He was leaning over a table, his back to her. Then, two orderlies entered, half carrying a man in the tattered uniform of a Japanese infantryman. He was from the men's compound. The man was whimpering, a high, thin sound of animal pain. Akiko pressed herself into the shadow by the wall. The orderlies placed the man on an examination table. "Boiling water from the kitchen, sir," one of them said. His hands. Captain Miller turned. Akiko could see his face clearly now. He looked tired. He motioned for the orderlies to step back. The prisoner, seeing Miller approach, scrambled backward on the table, trying to hide his hands, his eyes wide with terror. He was babbling in Japanese. "I am sorry. I am sorry. Do not hit me. I am sorry." Miller stopped. He held up his hands, palms open, just as he had done when he spoke to Akiko. "It's all right," Miller said. His voice was low, melodic. "Easy. I am a doctor. Ishi. Understand? Doctor." The prisoner only sobbed. Miller sighed, a small, frustrated sound. He looked at his orderly. "Morphine. 0.5. Now." Then, he turned back to the prisoner. He did not move closer. He simply began to talk. His voice a steady, calming drone. "We're going to fix this. It's not a big deal. Just some water. My wife, she did the same thing last Thanksgiving with the gravy. Made a hell of a mess." He was speaking nonsense. He knew the man could not understand. But the tone was a medicine in itself. The prisoner's sobs quieted. His breathing still hitched. Only when the orderly returned with the syringe did Miller move. He administered the morphine with a quick, practiced hand. And then, as the drug began to work, he gently took the man's arm. He said, using the one Japanese word he seemed to know, "It's okay." Akiko watched, her broom forgotten, as Miller began the slow, agonizingly gentle process of cleaning the severe burns. He was expert. His hands were steady. He was, she realized with a jolt, a very good doctor. He was not a barbarian. He was not a trick. The propaganda had been a lie. The apology had been real. Inhaling the familiar, painful scent of the infirmary, Akiko's world, which had been cracked by the broken bowl, now shattered completely. A week later, a guard came to Barracks 7. He did not shout. He read her name from a list. "Tanaka. Akiko. You're with me." The other women watched her go, their faces impassive, but Akiko could feel their eyes on her back. Etsuko's warning echoed in her head. The trap is the captain. She was marched. Not to the laundry or the kitchens, but directly to the infirmary. The fear returned, sharp and acidic. She had been caught observing, This was the punishment. She was led into a small office. Captain Miller was there, sitting behind a simple wooden desk, reviewing a file. He looked up, and for a moment, he seemed surprised, as if he had forgotten he had summoned her. "Ah, Nurse Tanaka, please." He motioned to the simple wooden chair opposite his desk. She did not sit. She stood at attention, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, her gaze fixed on the wall above his head. Miller sighed. He closed the file. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, speaking the same slow, simple English he had used at the lineup. We need help." He stood and walked past her, into the main ward. Akiko turned, compelled to follow. The ward was small, perhaps 12 beds, and it was full. Half were American soldiers, guards, drivers suffering from influenza or frostbite. The other half were Japanese prisoners from the men's compound, gaunt and silent. A single American nurse, a young woman with weary lines around her eyes, was trying to change a dressing on a Japanese prisoner. The prisoner flinched and pulled away every time she touched him, hissing in pain. "He doesn't understand," the nurse said to Miller, her voice tight with frustration. "I'm trying to tell him I need to debride this, or it'll go septic. He thinks I'm trying to hurt him." Miller watched for a moment. Akiko watched too. She could see the problem immediately. The nurse was being too hesitant. Her fear of hurting the man made her movements timid, which, in turn, signaled uncertainty and pain to the patient. "Nurse Tanaka," Miller said, his voice low. He gestured to the bed. Akiko looked at him. He was asking her to intervene. She felt a cold dread. But beneath it, something else stirred. A familiar, powerful instinct. She knew what to do. She stepped forward, past the American nurse. She bowed her head slightly to the Japanese soldier. "Gomen kudasai," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was the first time she had spoken in her professional capacity in months. The soldier's terrified eyes focused on her. She spoke rapidly in Japanese. "I am a nurse. This is a hospital. That woman is trying to help you. Your wound is infected. If we do not clean it, you will lose your leg. Do you understand?" The man stared, slack-jawed. "You must be still," Akiko commanded, her voice sharpening. "This will hurt, but it is necessary." The man swallowed. He nodded. Akiko turned to the American nurse. She could not speak the words, so she used her hands. She pointed to the wound, then made a sharp, quick, scraping motion in the air. Then she pointed to the nurse, then to the man, and shook her head. She pointed to herself. The American nurse looked at Miller, who nodded. "Go ahead." Akiko took the instruments from the tray. Her hands, which had trembled holding the porcelain bowl, were now perfectly steady. She worked quickly, her movements precise and economical. The soldier winced and hissed, but he did not pull away. In 2 minutes, it was done. She stepped back and motioned for the nurse to apply the new bandage. The ward was silent. The American nurse stared at her with a new respect. Miller had watched the entire exchange without a word. He motioned for Akiko to follow him back to his office. When they were inside, he closed the door. He went, not to his desk, but to a bookshelf. He pulled out a thin, cloth-bound book. "Your English is not good," he said. It was not a criticism, just a fact. "My Japanese is worse." He held the book out to her. Akiko looked at it. It was a standard English-Japanese dictionary of medical terms. She took it. It was her new anchor object. The paper was thin. The ink smelled slightly sweet. She traced the English letters on the cover. This was not a cheap, chipped bowl from a kitchen. This was a tool. A key. "You will work here," Miller said. 8-hour shifts. You will be assigned quarters with the other medical staff, away from the barracks. You will get the same rations we do. Akiko looked up from the book, stunned. Better quarters, better food. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. Etsuko. Miki. She was leaving them. She was being coddled. She was becoming the Inu, the collaborator. The dog is wrong, she managed, the word thick in her throat. Miller misunderstood. The work? No. The work is correct. You are a nurse. I am a doctor. That is all. He opened the door, signaling the end of the meeting. She felt the shame of collaboration. But beneath it, for the first time since Guam, she also felt the faint, returning pulse of her own purpose. The privilege was suffocating. It was not luxury. It was a small, clean room at the back of the infirmary, shared with the American, Nurse Larson. But it was warm. It was always warm. The coffee was the worst part. Every morning, Nurse Larson would pour her a cup from the percolator. It was hot, bitter, and real. Akiko would drink it, feeling the warmth spread through her, and she would be consumed by a paralyzing guilt. The food was better. Bread that was soft, not hardtack. Sometimes eggs, small portions of meat. In Barracks 7, the women were surviving on oatmeal and thin soup. Here, Akiko was living. This was the coddling the local newspaper had written about. This was the soft power of America. And it felt like a betrayal. She clutched the medical dictionary as she walked. It had become her shield, her justification. She spent every waking hour she was not working translating. Clavicle. Tourniquet. Penicillin. The words were a fortress. As long as she was studying, she was a nurse, not a prisoner. As long as she was a nurse, she was not a traitor. The confrontation, when it came, was inevitable. It happened near the latrines, the one place where the camp's rigid hierarchies briefly overlapped. Akiko was returning from her shift, and Etsuko, the head nurse from Manila, was leading a cleaning detail with Miki. Miki saw her first. The girl's eyes widened, and she immediately looked down at the bucket she was carrying, her face flushing with shame. But Etsuko stepped directly into Akiko's path. The work is hard. Inu. Etsuko's voice was low, venomous. Inu. The dog. The spy. Akiko stopped. The air crackled between them. Etsuko-san. Akiko said, her voice quiet. Please. Let me pass. You eat their food now. Etsuko said, ignoring the request. She stepped closer. You sleep in their warm rooms. Does the captain keep you warm at night too? The accusation was so vile, so cheap, that Akiko flinched as if struck. That is not true, she whispered. You have left us, Etsuko said, her voice breaking with a cold fury that was far more terrifying than the Akaoni's pointless rage. You walk among them. You use your book. She pointed at the dictionary in Akiko's hands. You are his pet. A.T. I am a nurse, Akiko said, finding her voice. It was shaking. You were a nurse, Etsuko corrected. For the emperor. Now you are a tool for the barbarians. A good Japanese nurse would have taken her own life on Guam before allowing this. You have no honor. Epines. 19. Epines. The words hit their mark. The shame, the guilt, the fear, it all coalesced into a single, burning point of anger. Akiko looked up, meeting Etsuko's eyes for the first time. He is a doctor, Akiko said, her voice suddenly clear, steady, and sharp. Etsuko blinked, momentarily surprised by the change in tone. That man, Akiko continued, the prisoner with the burns on his hands. He would have lost his arms. Captain Miller saved them. He is a doctor. I am a nurse. The war. The war does not change the medicine. It was the turning point. She was not defending Miller, the American. She was not defending herself. She was defending the work. She was defending the shared, human creed that had been awakened in her when she watched him treat the prisoner. The same creed that had guided her own hands. Etsuko stared at her, her face unreadable. The fury had been replaced by a cold, final judgment. She looked at Akiko, as one would look at something already dead. "You have chosen," Etsuko said. She turned her back on Akiko. Miki, who had been frozen, scurried over, refusing to meet Akiko's gaze. Etsuko led her cleaning detail away. Akiko stood alone. The path now clear. She was, she realized, an island. She was no longer truly Japanese to Etsuko. She would never be American. She was something else, something isolated in the middle. She clutched the dictionary tighter. She turned and walked. Not to Barracks 7, but to the infirmary, to her small, warm room. She sat on her cot, opened the book to the next chapter, and continued her work. November 1945. The war had been over for 3 months, but Camp Rupert remained. The surrender had arrived over the crackling camp radio, a static-filled broadcast that had left the Japanese prisoners in a state of stunned, hollow silence. The armed guards still walked the perimeter, but their rifles were slung with a profound casualness. The tension that had defined Akiko's existence, the sharp, electric fear of the Aka Oni, the broken bowl had evaporated, replaced by a dull, heavy uncertainty. They were no longer POWs. They were cargo, waiting for shipping instructions. Then came the announcement of the ritual. Nurse Larson explained it to Akiko, pointing to the date on the calendar. "It's Thanksgiving, Akiko, a holiday." Akiko pulled out her medical dictionary. It had few non-medical terms, but she found Thanksgiving, referenced in an appendix of American holidays. Kanshasai, a day of gratitude. "Gratitude?" Akiko asked, testing the English word. "For what?" "For the harvest," Larson said, her cheerfulness strained. "For family. For, you know, the end of the war." Akiko looked at her. Gratitude for the end of a war that America had won, celebrated in front of those who had lost everything. The absurdity was breathtaking. The ritual was controversial, not just among the prisoners. A new editorial had appeared in the Rupert Pioneer, tacked to the mess hall bulletin board. Akiko, whose English had improved vastly, read it with a cold knot in her stomach. "Why is the army fattening these Japs with turkey and pie?" it demanded. "My nephew is buried in the Pacific. Send them home, or put them to work rebuilding what they broke. Do not feast them." Captain Miller had torn the clipping down, but the sentiment lingered in the air. Etsuko declared she would not go. "It is a celebration of our defeat. It is propaganda. Let them eat their victory feast alone." But Akiko, to her own surprise, felt compelled. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was staff. To refuse would be an insult to Nurse Larson, and perhaps to Miller. She told herself it was diplomacy, but she knew it was also curiosity. The infirmary staff went to the mess hall together. The moment she opened the door, the scent struck her. It was overwhelming. Not the thin, watery smell of oatmeal or the sourness of boiled cabbage. It was rich, warm, and sweet. It smelled of roasted meat, of baked bread, and something else, a heavy, unfamiliar spice. Cinnamon. The hall was crowded. Soldiers and prisoners ate in the same room, though at separate tables. Swing music, impossibly cheerful, played from a large radio in the corner. At the head of the serving line, Captain Miller stood next to the cooks. He was wearing an apron over his uniform, a ladle in his hand. A sight so incongruous Akiko almost laughed. He was serving turkey and mashed potatoes to soldiers and prisoners alike. When Akiko reached him, he looked up. His face, which she had first seen tight with anger at the private and later weary with professional concentration, was different. He looked tired, but genuinely pleased. "Nurse Tanaka," he said, giving her a small smile. He piled her plate high. "You must be tired of Spam by now." He added a scoop of bright orange mush. And then, he cut a large slice of pumpkin pie and placed it beside the turkey. "Happy Thanksgiving," he said. Akiko found a seat alone, near the window. She stared at the plate. This was the enemy's food. The food of the victors. She felt Etsuko's judgment, like a physical presence. She felt the eyes of the Rupert Pioneer's editor. She picked up the fork. She tried the pie first. The texture was soft, almost liquid, and the taste, it was impossibly sweet. Not the delicate sweetness of bean paste, but a deep, earthy sweetness combined with that strange, warm spice. It was the flavor of autumn, of warmth, of safety. A sudden, violent tremor ran through her. She thought of her broken bowl, of the gray oatmeal spilling onto the ice. That was the taste of terror. This was the taste of peace. She did not know if her family in Tokyo was alive or dead. She was a citizen of a ruined nation. She was a traitor to her friends. And she was sitting in an American camp, eating a sweet pie given to her by the enemy. The contradictions were too much. Akiko began to cry. She did not sob or make a sound. The tears simply streamed down her face, hot and silent, falling onto the plate. It was not a cry of fear or of sadness. It was a cry of profound, total confusion. She looked up, embarrassed, and wiped her face. Across the room, Captain Miller was watching her. He was not smiling. He simply held her gaze for a second, his eyes filled with a quiet, human understanding. He nodded, once, and then turned back to serve the next man in line. He was not a barbarian. He was not a symbol. He was just a man, wearing an apron. The taste of the pumpkin pie lingered for a day. The guilt lasted much longer. It was December now. The brief, strange warmth of the Thanksgiving ritual had faded, replaced by the deep, biting cold of an Idaho winter. Snow piled in drifts against the barracks, muffling the camp in a heavy, oppressive silence. The war was over, but the waiting was its own kind of torture. Repatriation was coming, they were told. Ships were being arranged, but the silence from home was absolute. Akiko's work in the infirmary was a mercy. It kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. Her English, fortified by hours spent memorizing the medical dictionary, was now functional, if not fluent. She could read the American newspapers the guards sometimes left behind in the mess hall. She read them with a growing, cold horror. The articles, no longer censored by wartime necessity, spoke of the firebombing of Tokyo in March. They printed photographs. They described a city turned to ash, of unprecedented destruction. Akiko would read these accounts in the small, warm office, the smell of coffee in the air, and feel a profound sense of dislocation. She was reading about the apocalypse of her people while sitting in the comfortable heart of the enemy's nation. She traced the map of Tokyo in her mind, trying to calculate if the fires had reached her family's small wooden house in the Koto district. The papers listed Koto as one of the worst hit. The guilt was a physical weight. It made the soft bed feel hard. The warm coffee taste like ash. Every bite of food was an act of betrayal. She thought of her mother and younger sister. Had they eaten? Had they run? Had they burned? She had been safe. She had been warm. She had eaten pie. The other Japanese, both in the barracks and in the men's compound, were consumed by the same desperate, silent hunger for information. They crowded around the camp bulletin board, waiting for the one thing that mattered: the Red Cross lists. The International Red Cross was slowly compiling lists of survivors, of displaced persons, of the dead. But the information trickled in, chaotic and incomplete. Akiko stopped Captain Miller outside the ward. "Sir," she said, her voice tight. "The lists. From Tokyo. Do you see them?" Miller's face, which had been open and almost cheerful during the holiday, was now guarded. He knew what she was asking. "The Red Cross communications come through command, nurse. Not through the infirmary. I only see what Sergeant Coombs posts on the board. But it is too slow," Akiko whispered, the desperation breaking through her professional demeanor. "My family. In Koto." Miller looked at her. He saw the sleeplessness in her eyes, the strain that had nothing to do with her work. He hesitated, making a decision. "My office. In 10 minutes," he said quietly, and walked away. She went, her heart hammering. He was in his office, the door closed. A single piece of paper was on his desk. It was not a personal letter. It was a flimsily mimeographed bulletin, marked ICRC, Tokyo Prefecture Report, for internal use only. "This is not for posting," Miller said, his voice low. "It's an administrative report for Camp Command, for repatriation planning. I am not supposed to show you this." Akiko did not move. "I cannot tell you if your family is alive," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I do not have a list of names. I am sorry. But this is a status report on the city districts." He pushed the paper toward her. Akiko's eyes scanned the page. It was a cold, bureaucratic list of neighborhoods, and next to each, a percentage. Shibuya-ku, 45% destroyed. Shinjuku-ku, 70% destroyed. Her finger traced down the page, shaking. She found it. Koto-ku, 98% destroyed. Akiko stared at the number. 98%. It was an abstraction, a number on a page that meant total annihilation. It meant her street was gone. Her house was gone. The cherry tree in the small garden was gone. The probability that her family had survived was 2%. She did not cry. She felt a strange, cold emptiness. "Akiko," Miller said, using her first name for the first time. This is a report of structures, not people. Many were evacuated. You cannot know. But she did know. She knew the reality of the firestorm. There was no evacuation. She looked at him. He had not lied to her. He had not given her false hope. He had given her the truth, an act that was, in its own way, the deepest form of respect. He had trusted her to be strong enough to handle it. "Thank you, Captain," she said, her voice a dry rasp. She placed her hands on the desk to steady herself. She was a survivor. She had been safe in the enemy's camp while her world burned. The guilt was no longer a feeling. It was a fact. It was who she was now. Akiko sat on her cot in the infirmary room, the air cold. It was early, 1946. The snow was piled high outside, just as it had been that first terrible winter. Repatriation was no longer a rumor, but a matter of lists and logistics. She was packing. She folded her spare uniform, the wool still smelling faintly of carbolic soap. At the bottom of her small crate was the medical dictionary Miller had given her. She had survived. She had survived the war, the shame, the guilt, and the profound, disorienting kindness of the enemy. She had often marked the change in her life from that Thanksgiving dinner. The taste of the pumpkin pie had been the moment she allowed herself to feel a human connection. But she knew, as she traced the cover of the dictionary, that the pie was not the true turning point. The real shift, the moment the balance of power had irrevocably changed, had happened long before, almost a year earlier. She closed her eyes, and the memory returned, sharp and clear. It was the 12th of March, 1945. 6 weeks after the incident, with the broken bowl. The infirmary was running low on quinine and sulfanilamide powder. The main supply shed was across the compound, near the guardhouse outside of Miller's immediate domain. Nurse Larson was down with the flu. It fell to Akiko to retrieve the supplies. She walked out of the infirmary, carrying the requisition slip Miller had signed. The ground was a misery of melting snow and frozen mud. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. The fear that had defined her first weeks had dulled, replaced by the confidence of her work, but she was still keenly aware of the guards. They treated her differently now. She was the captain's nurse. She had his protection. She approached the supply shed. A single guard stood duty, leaning against the doorframe, smoking a cigarette. Akiko froze. It was him, the Akaoni, Private One. She had not seen him in weeks. The rumor was that Miller's report had been severe, and the private had spent the intervening time on the worst details the camp had to offer: latrines, garbage disposal, hauling coal in the dark. Now, he was back on regular duty. He saw her. His body went rigid. The lazy slouch vanished. He dropped his cigarette, grinding it out under his boot. Akiko's heart hammered. This was the moment she had dreaded. She was alone. Miller was a building away. The private's humiliation had been public. Now, he had the chance for revenge. She stopped 10 feet away, holding the requisition slip. It trembled in her hand. He stared at her, his face flushing that familiar, dull pink. She could smell the sharp, stale tobacco on him. He looked at the paper she was holding, then at her face. His hand twitched, moving toward the holstered pistol at his hip. Akiko met his gaze. She did not bow her head. She did not look away. She remembered the broken bowl. She remembered the burns on the soldier's hands. She remembered Miller's apology. She saw, in that instant, that he was no longer a demon. He was just a boy. A young, angry, embarrassed boy who had been publicly shamed by a superior officer. He looked away first. His gaze dropped to the mud. He muttered something. Not to her, but to the ground. "What do ya want?" "Supplies," Akiko said, her voice surprisingly steady. "For the infirmary." She held out the paper. He did not take it. He turned, fumbling with the large ring of keys on his belt. His hands were clumsy. He seemed unable to find the right one. He cursed under his breath, unlocked the heavy padlock, and pulled the door open. He jested. "In. Get 'em." He did not look at her. He stepped aside, his face averted, staring out at the wire fence as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. Akiko walked past him, into the dark, musty shed. She gathered the supplies, her hands shaking now, but not from fear. It was adrenaline. It was release. When she came back out, he was still there, a statue of humiliation. He locked the door behind her. She began to walk away. She had taken 3 steps when he spoke. "He ain't always gonna be here, you know," he said, his voice low and resentful. Akiko stopped. She turned. He was still refusing to look at her. "The captain. He's just a doc. This war ain't gonna last forever. The captain. The confer important." "I know," Akiko said. She turned and walked away, leaving him by the door. She had won. Miller's decency, his simple apology, had proven to be a stronger weapon than the private's gun. As she approached the infirmary, she saw a new truck by the processing barracks. A new group of prisoners was being herded out. They looked just as she had, thin, exhausted, and wide-eyed with terror. A young girl, Miki, flinched violently when a different guard walked past, his rifle slung. The girl hid her face against an older woman's shoulder. Akiko walked over to them. She remembered the sound of porcelain shattering. She remembered the taste of pie. She put her hand on Miki's arm. "Daijobu," Akiko whispered, the Japanese word feeling strange and new in this place. "It is okay. They, They are different here. February 1946. The day had come. The camp, which had once been a universe of fear, was now just a collection of empty, echoing buildings. The wire was still there, but the gates stood open. Akiko stood by a line of drab green U.S. Army trucks. They were not the same trucks that had brought her here, terrified, in the dark. These were here to take her away, to a processing center in Seattle, and then to a ship. Her crate was already loaded. It contained her few possessions, and at the very bottom, the cloth-bound medical dictionary. The air was frigid, but clean. The sharp, familiar scent of pine was mixed with the heavy smell of diesel exhaust. The sound of engines idling was the sound of departure. She saw Nurse Larson one last time, by the infirmary door. The American nurse, her face worn from the long winter, pulled Akiko into a brief, awkward hug. "You take care, Akiko. You were a damned good nurse." "You, also," Akiko said, the English words feeling small and inadequate. There was one last person to see. She found Captain Miller in his office. He was not behind his desk. The room was bare, his own crates packed and stacked by the door. He was standing at the window, looking out at the compound, his hands in his pockets. "Nurse Tanaka," he said, hearing her step. He turned. "Sir, Captain Miller is fine, Akiko. The war is over." He smiled, but it was a tired, sad smile. "Do you know where you will go? In Japan? My district is gone," she said, stating the fact as she had come to accept it. "I will find work, Red Cross, perhaps. I am a nurse." "Yes, you are," he said. He looked at her, truly seeing her, not as a prisoner, not as staff, but as a colleague. "I wanted to. I'm glad I had the chance to work with you. You saved lives here. Not just Japanese ones. Nomer. Quote. Nomer. 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 Nomer." He reached into his desk drawer. The last thing left unpacked. He pulled out a small, stiff piece of cardboard. It was a postcard. On the front was a brightly colored photograph of snow-capped mountains. The Rocky Mountains. Idaho. He began, sounding awkward, like he had at the Thanksgiving dinner. "I wanted you to have this. It's just a silly souvenir." But he turned it over. He had written something on the back, but he held it, so she could not see. "It's to remember," he said, struggling for the words, just as he had that first day. "To remember that not all of us, not everything, was like that." That. The word hung in the air. It meant the shouting. It meant the aka oni. It meant the broken bowl and the hatred. Akiko took the postcard. The cardboard was stiff and new in her hand. A final, tangible, anchor object. She thought of the porcelain bowl, shattered on the frozen ground. She thought of the hatred she had carried, the terror that had been programmed into her. She looked at this man, who had shown her a different reality. "I will remember, Captain," she said. She did not need to see what he had written. She tucked the postcard safely into her coat pocket. She bowed. Not a subservient bow of a prisoner, but the deep, formal, respectful bow of one professional to another. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, his throat tight. "Good luck, Akiko." She turned and walked out of the infirmary for the last time. She walked past the spot where her bowl had shattered. It was just mud and gravel now. She walked to the truck and climbed in, joining the other silent women. The engine roared to life, and the truck lurched forward, carrying her toward the gate, toward the ship, toward a future she could not imagine. But as she sat in the darkness, her hand in her pocket, she felt the sharp, reassuring edge of the postcard, and she knew she was not leaving empty-handed. She was carrying the memory of an apology, and the knowledge that a world, once broken, could be remade.